For years, she worked in silence, hiding a devastating secret. He never noticed her, never cared, until one day he opened a forgotten safe, and his entire life fell apart. Ethan always believed he was the rightful son of the wealthy family that raised him. As a successful yet cold-hearted businessman, he never questioned his origins. To him, Margaret was just a housekeeper, a woman who had worked in his mansion for decades, nothing more. But when he stumbles upon a locked safe containing long-forgotten documents, his entire world crumbles. Margaret was not just a servant, she was his biological mother. Even worse, he had never been abandoned, he had been stolen. A heart-wrenching conspiracy had torn them apart, but fate was about to intervene. Now, Ethan must choose. Face the truth and seek redemption, or continue living the carefully crafted lie that built his empire. Margaret had spent 30 years in that house. 30 years serving, cleaning, watching from the shadows. She had seen children grow up, families celebrate, fortunes expand. But no one ever saw her. To them, she was just the housekeeper, someone who belonged to the walls, to the background, to silence. Ethan Whitmore had never questioned her presence. Why would he? She had always been there, arranging his father's suits, preparing his mother's afternoon tea, ensuring that every inch of their mansion gleamed with perfection. She existed for their convenience. Nothing more. He was cold, powerful, and untouchable. Born into privilege, raised to rule. The world bent to his will, and those who worked for him were nothing but tools to maintain his empire. Margaret was no different, just another faceless servant, someone who had been in the house since before he could remember. And yet, he had never once spoken her name. She had spent decades enduring his indifference, watching him walk past her without a glance, hearing him speak without acknowledging her existence. She had held back tears when he humiliated her in front of guests, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as if she were nothing. And worst of all, she had swallowed every word. Because what choice did she have? No one had ever asked about her story. No one cared where she had come from, why she had stayed, what she had lost. They saw her hands scrub the floors, but they never saw them tremble when she read old letters in the dark of night. They heard her footsteps in the halls, but they never heard the silent prayers she whispered before bed. They saw a woman who had given her life to them, but they never saw the life that had been taken from her. Ethan never noticed the way she looked at him sometimes, with something that wasn't quite admiration, but wasn't quite resentment either. He never questioned why she never left, why she never asked for more, why she never had a family of her own. Because men like him don't ask questions about people like her. But Margaret knew the truth. She had always known. And no matter how much time had passed, some wounds never fade. Some losses are too great to heal. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. One day, when fate decided the time was right, Ethan Whitmore would learn who Margaret truly was. But by then, it might be too late. Margaret moved through the mansion like a ghost. She was present in every room, yet no one ever truly saw her. From the moment the sun rose until long after it set, she worked in silence, dusting, sweeping, scrubbing, ensuring that everything was in perfect order. Perfection was expected. Anything less was unacceptable. The Whitmores lived in excess, basking in luxury that Margaret could only observe from a distance. Ethan, their only son, had inherited their cold, demanding nature. He would glide past her without a second glance, issuing orders with the sharpness of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. To him, Margaret was nothing but a fixture of the house, unimportant, replaceable. She had learned to endure his arrogance. She had endured it when he was a child, throwing tantrums over things he would forget within minutes. She had endured it when he became a teenager, too important to acknowledge the people who made his life effortless. And now, as a man, his cruelty had refined itself into something sharper, more deliberate. Sometimes, he would speak as if she weren't there at all. "Get rid of this mess," he would say, gesturing toward a table she had just polished. Or worse, when in the company of his associates, he would mock her presence. Imagine living your whole life as a maid. Can you even call that a life? The laughter that followed always stung, but Margaret never let it show, because showing pain meant giving them power. She would never let them see how their words weighed on her. She had suffered through far worse. The world had taken more from her than they could ever imagine. The scars she carried were not ones they could see. Ethan never once questioned why she stayed, why she had spent her life within these walls, why she never left, why she never sought something more. But Margaret knew why. She had a reason. She had always had a reason. And one day Ethan would understand, whether he was ready or not. Margaret had learned long ago that silence was her greatest weapon. In this house, words held no value unless spoken by the powerful. Servants who talked too much disappeared, replaced without a second thought. So she became invisible, a shadow that moved where needed, never asking, never questioning. Silence kept her safe. Silence kept her close. Every morning, she rose before the sun, preparing the house for another day of wealth and indulgence. She moved through endless halls, cleaning rooms she would never sleep in, setting tables she would never dine at. The Whitmores lived their lives in luxury, completely unaware of the hands that made it possible. Margaret ensured everything was perfect, yet she herself was treated as a flaw in the background. Ethan was no different. Born into privilege, he had never known hunger, never faced struggle. His life had been crafted for him, free of hardship, free of sacrifice. He had been raised to believe that those who served were beneath him, and so he never looked at Margaret, not truly. Sometimes she allowed herself to wonder. If she had spoken sooner, if she had reached out, would things have been different? Would Ethan have seen her as more than a housekeeper? Or had the years of separation built a wall too high to tear down? She knew better than to hope. Hope had betrayed her before. Decades had passed, and still, she remained in the shadows, watching, waiting. She had spent a lifetime swallowing the truth. But no secret stayed buried forever. One day, the past would catch up to them. And when it did, Ethan Whitmore would finally have to face the truth. Ethan Whitmore was everything his parents had molded him to be: ruthless, untouchable, and completely indifferent to those beneath him. He had inherited his father's sharp instincts and his mother's calculated charm, a perfect combination for a man destined to rule an empire. But beneath the tailored suits and carefully rehearsed smiles, there was nothing. No warmth, no compassion, only ambition. He built his fortune on control, ensuring that nothing and no one stood in his way. Emotions were liabilities, distractions reserved for the weak. The world belonged to men like him, men who took what they wanted and discarded what no longer served them. That was the way of power, and Ethan had no intention of losing it. To him, Margaret was just another cog in the machine, a nameless woman who existed to make his life easier. He never bothered to learn her story, never once considered that she had a past of her own. Why would he? People like her didn't matter. Only results did. Even when she lingered in the corner of his vision, her hands folding his shirts with quiet precision, her footsteps light against the marble floors, he never spared her a thought. She had always been there, and she always would be, or so he believed. Margaret had watched his transformation in silence. The boy who once laughed without restraint had become a man who measured every word. The child who once reached for her hand in the dark had grown into a stranger with ice in his veins. And yet, she never stopped watching, because no matter how much time had passed, no matter how cruel he had become, Ethan Whitmore was still her son. But he didn't know that. Not yet. Margaret had never lived for herself. Every breath, every step, every sacrifice had been made for someone else. She had endured suffering that would have broken most, yet she remained standing, not because she was strong, but because she had no other choice. The Whitmore mansion had been her cage for decades. She moved within its walls like a prisoner, bound by invisible chains. Each day bled into the next, a cycle of labor and silence, of unspoken grief and unanswered prayers. She had lost everything, yet here she was, still serving the people who had taken it all. The world saw a simple housekeeper, a woman without ambition, without purpose. But they didn't see what lay beneath. They didn't know about the nights she spent awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if her suffering had been in vain, if the son she had lost was still out there. if he even remembered she existed. She had dreamed of a different life once. A life where she was free, where she was loved. But dreams were dangerous. Dreams made people reckless, and reckless people ended up with nothing. So she had learned to accept her fate. But fate was cruel. It had placed her so close to what she had lost, yet so far away. She had spent years pretending not to care, convincing herself that simply being near him was enough. But the truth was suffocating. How much longer could she endure this? How much longer could she watch Ethan walk past her, never knowing who she really was? One day something would break. One day the truth would come crashing down. And when that day came, Margaret would no longer be silent. Ethan had never been a man who cared for the details of other people's lives. His world revolved around power, status, and efficiency. He surrounded himself with people who mattered: investors, politicians, leaders who spoke his language, servants, employees, and those who lived in the shadows of his success. They didn't exist. Margaret was no exception. She had been there his entire life, yet he knew nothing about her. He didn't know where she came from, how long she had worked for his family, or even if she had a family of her own. He had never cared enough to ask. She was always present but never acknowledged. He never noticed the way her hands trembled when she reached for his father's old documents. Never questioned why she never took time off, never left, never spoke unless spoken to. She was just there. Even when she looked at him differently, as if she carried some unspoken burden, as if she wanted to say something but always held back. He ignored it. He had bigger concerns: a business empire to expand, deals to close, enemies to destroy. A housekeeper's glances were meaningless. Margaret had learned to bear the weight of his indifference. She had swallowed years of silence, convinced herself that being invisible was the only way to survive. But every cold stare, every dismissive wave of his hand chipped away at the last pieces of her strength. How much longer could she endure it? One day Ethan would see her. One day he would learn the truth. But by then, he might have already lost the only person who had ever truly loved him. Margaret had mastered the art of swallowing pain. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked. She endured it all in silence. But some wounds never truly healed, and some words cut deeper than a blade. It happened over dinner, in the grand dining hall where laughter and crystal glasses filled the air. Ethan sat at the head of the table, surrounded by men who shared his hunger for power. Margaret moved through the room like a shadow, pouring wine, clearing plates, invisible as always. And then the conversation shifted. One of Ethan's colleagues, a man drunk on both liquor and arrogance, turned his gaze toward Margaret. "I don't know how you live like this," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Spending your whole life cleaning up after people who don't even know your name." Laughter erupted around the table. Ethan smirked but didn't spare Margaret a glance. "Some people are born to serve," he replied casually, swirling his drink. "That's just how the world works." Margaret stood frozen for a moment, not because the words hurt. She had heard worse, but because they had come from him, her son. She lowered her gaze and continued her work. Not a single tear fell. Not a single word escaped her lips. Because in that moment, she realized something painful. Ethan wasn't just blind to the truth. He would never believe it. At least, not until the truth was undeniable. Margaret had spent a lifetime in Ethan's shadow, but she had never stopped watching him. She knew his habits, his expressions, the way he clenched his jaw when something frustrated him. She knew the man he had become, even if he had no idea who she truly was. She had been there when he was a child, wiping his tears when he scraped his knee, humming lullabies when the storms outside kept him awake. But as he grew, those moments faded. His adoptive parents made sure of that. Affection was weakness, and the Whitmores had no use for weakness. Even now, when Ethan returned home late from meetings, Margaret still waited in the shadows, listening for his footsteps, ensuring he was safe. She told herself it was routine, habit, but deep down it was something more. A mother's instinct, a bond that had never truly been broken. But Ethan was too blind to see it. too consumed by his world of power to notice the woman who had loved him from the start. He passed her in the hallways without a second glance, issued commands without realizing she had anticipated his needs before he even spoke. She was the one constant in his life, yet he treated her as if she were nothing. Some nights, Margaret wondered if she had made a mistake, if staying close to him had been the wrong choice, if she should have walked away, left the past buried where it belonged. But how could she? How could she abandon him again, even if he didn't know the truth? One day, the truth would come to light. One day, Ethan would look at her and finally see what had been in front of him all along. But by then, would it be too late? Ethan Whitmore was a man who thrived on control. His life was built on structure, power, and the certainty that nothing could shake him. But even the strongest walls had cracks. And one night, Margaret saw them. It was past midnight when he returned home. His tie was loosened, his shoulders tense, his usual arrogance replaced by something else. Frustration, exhaustion. He walked straight to the bar in the study, pouring himself a drink with hands that trembled slightly. Something had gone wrong. Margaret lingered in the doorway, unseen. She had witnessed him at his highest, surrounded by success. But tonight, he looked a human. For the first time in years, he reminded her of the boy he once was. She hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. "Would you like me to bring you something to eat?" Her voice was calm, careful. An offering, not an intrusion. Ethan didn't even turn around. "I don't need anything," he muttered, taking another sip. The coldness in his tone was familiar, but there was something beneath it this time, something unsteady. Margaret should have left. She should have turned around and disappeared like she always did. But she didn't, because despite everything, she still saw the child she had lost, buried beneath the man he had become. "Even the strongest men need to rest," she said quietly. Her words weren't meant to challenge him, only to remind him that he wasn't invincible. For a brief moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, slowly, he set his glass down. A sigh escaped him, quiet, almost defeated. But just as quickly as the vulnerability appeared, it was gone. He straightened, his mask slipping back into place. "Go home, Margaret," he said, dismissing her like he always did. She left without another word. But deep inside, she knew something was changing. The days at Whitmore Manor followed the same unshakable rhythm, meticulously planned, perfectly executed without deviation. Margaret had spent years adapting to its cold precision, molding herself into a piece of its machinery. She moved silently, spoke only when necessary, and ensured that her presence was never felt beyond what was required. But no matter how much she tried to erase herself, there were days when the weight of her reality pressed against her chest like a crushing force. Ethan had no idea how much he had taken from her, how every moment she spent in his presence was both a blessing and a curse. The pain of being so close yet so far, of watching him build a life that never once included her. The way he addressed her with the same detached tone he used with strangers, the way his eyes skimmed over her without recognition, it was an agony she carried alone. One evening, as Margaret cleared the remnants of yet another grand Whitmore dinner, she heard Ethan's voice, sharp, irritated, impatient. She turned the corner to see him standing in the foyer, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand clenched at his side. His frustration was evident, his brows furrowed, his tone laced with cold finality. "I don't care about excuses. Fix it or you're done." He ended the call without another word, his fingers tightening around the device before exhaling sharply. His entire posture radiated stress, the weight of his world pressing down on him. Margaret hesitated at the edge of the hallway. She had witnessed Ethan's anger before, had been subjected to his icy disregard more times than she could count. But this time, something was different. This wasn't just frustration. There was something deeper, something unspoken simmering beneath the surface. Gathering her courage, she spoke. "Is everything all right, sir?" Her voice was steady, betraying none of the emotions that clawed at her chest. Ethan turned, his gaze settling on her for the briefest moment before he scoffed. "Since when do you care?" The words were a dagger, sharp, dismissive, designed to remind her of her place. Margaret flinched but held her ground. For years, she had let his words cut her, let them reinforce the walls between them. But not tonight, not when she could see, even for a second, the exhaustion behind his anger. "You shouldn't carry everything alone," she said softly. The words were simple, but they carried a depth he wouldn't understand, at least not yet. Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You think you know me?" His eyes met hers then, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "You don't." He was right. She didn't know this version of him, the man who had built himself from steel and stone, who had buried his past so deep that not even he could remember where it began. But she had known him once, long before he had become Ethan Whitmore, and that was something he would never take from her. The silence that filled the Whitmore mansion was deafening at times. It was a silence that spoke volumes, one that weighed down on every corner, every room, and every hallway. It was the silence of a family that had stopped being a family long ago. Margaret could hear it in the way the house seemed to sigh when Ethan walked through its doors, like a living thing too tired to resist. No love, no warmth, only cold, calculated duty. But that silence would not last forever. Margaret had spent decades hiding her truth, keeping her heartache locked away behind the stone walls of the mansion. Yet every time she looked at Ethan, she couldn't help but remember the child she had lost. A child she had been forced to give up. A child who had never known the woman who gave him life. It was late one night when it happened, the night everything shifted. Ethan was gone, attending to business as usual, leaving the mansion to her care. She had become accustomed to this, to the endless hours of solitude where time slipped by unnoticed. But this time something was different. There was a pull, a feeling that today was the day the truth would reveal itself. Margaret couldn't explain it, but she knew she could no longer hide from it. In the dimly lit study, Margaret stood in front of an old chest. The chest had always been there, tucked away in the far corner of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs. She had ignored it for years, telling herself it was better left undisturbed. But tonight, she felt an overwhelming need to open it, to face what she had locked away. With trembling hands, she unlocked the chest. Inside, she found the documents, the pictures, the letters, the evidence that Ethan had been stolen from her. The words on the papers hit her like a tidal wave, crashing against her chest. They were undeniable. As she read, the memories came flooding back. The day he was taken, the horror in her heart when she was forced to leave him behind. She had never stopped looking for him, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would be reunited. But no one had ever told Ethan the truth. No one had told him that his life had been stolen from her. And now, Ethan was living a lie, unaware of the family that had never stopped loving him. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing that he might never forgive her. Margaret sat frozen before the open chest, her hands trembling over the fragile papers that held decades of stolen time. The documents felt heavier than they should have, as if the weight of the truth was pressing down on her fingertips. Letters she had written but never sent. A birth certificate that bore a name Ethan had never known as his own. Official records proving what had been done to them. Proof that her child had been taken, that his life had been rewritten. Her breath came in uneven waves as she traced the faded ink, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was the moment she had prayed for, and yet, the fear clawing at her chest was suffocating. She had dreamed of the day she would reunite with her son, imagined what she would say, how she would explain the pain of losing him. But now that the truth was in her hands, she realized something gut-wrenching. Ethan did not want this truth. He was a Whitmore in every sense of the word. Ruthless, pragmatic, emotionally distant. The love she had carried for him, the years she had waited in silence, the sacrifices she had made just to stay close to him. None of it would matter. Ethan would see this as betrayal, an intrusion into the life he believed was his. To him, she was nothing but a housekeeper, a woman he could replace with a single phone call. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that tears accomplished nothing. She had cried the night they took her son, cried the nights she spent searching for him, cried in every silent moment she had spent watching him from the shadows. She had no more tears left to give. She carefully folded the documents and placed them back in the chest, locking them away once more. Not because she didn't want to tell Ethan, but because she didn't know if she had the strength to survive his rejection. Margaret stood, taking one last look at the chest before stepping away. She had carried this burden for so long, and tonight she made a decision. She would wait. She would wait until the moment was right, until Ethan was ready to hear the truth. But deep in her heart, she feared that moment might never come. The days passed, but Margaret no longer moved with the same quiet acceptance. Something had shifted within her, a storm building beneath the surface. She had spent years swallowing the truth, forcing herself to endure Ethan's cold indifference, convincing herself that being near him was enough. But it wasn't. Not anymore. She watched him more closely now, searching for cracks in the armor he wore so well. He was powerful, yes, but he was not unbreakable. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, where she caught glimpses of the boy he once was. The way his hands clenched when he was lost in thought, the exhaustion in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the rare flickers of something almost human beneath his carefully sculpted exterior. But Ethan had spent too many years pretending not to feel, and Margaret feared that when the truth finally came, he would reject it. Reject her. One evening, as she cleared the study, she found herself pausing in front of his desk. Stacks of reports, financial statements, contracts, all perfectly organized just like him. But something stood out. A single old photograph tucked beneath a pile of documents. Her heart pounded as she carefully pulled it free. It was Ethan as a child, no older than 3, his small hands clutching a toy airplane, a wide grin on his face. Margaret's breath caught. She remembered that smile. She had been there the day that picture was taken. She had held him in her arms, kissed his forehead, whispered promises of a future they would never get. And now, here he was, the same child, yet a stranger to her. She was so lost in the memory that she didn't hear Ethan enter the room. "What are you doing?" His voice was sharp, his presence suddenly looming behind her. Margaret stiffened, clutching the photo for a moment before setting it down carefully. "Just tidying up, sir." Ethan's gaze flickered to the photograph, his jaw tightening. For the briefest moment, something unreadable flashed in his expression. But then, just as quickly, his walls went up again. "That's not your concern." Margaret lowered her head. "Of course, sir." She turned to leave, her fingers twitching at her sides, aching to reach for him, to say something, to tell him. But the time wasn't right. Not yet. As she walked away, she knew one thing for certain. The unraveling had begun. Ethan Whitmore was not a man who allowed himself to dwell on the past. He had been taught that nostalgia was for the weak, that emotions clouded judgment. But ever since that night in the study, when he had caught Margaret holding that photograph, something unsettled him. A feeling he couldn't name, a weight he couldn't shake. The photo itself was unremarkable. A child's smile frozen in time, a memory long buried beneath years of carefully curated detachment. But there was something about the way Margaret had looked at it, the way her fingers had lingered on the edges as if touching something precious, as if it meant something to her. He told himself it was nothing, just the sentimental foolishness of a woman who had been in this house too long. Yet, over the next few days, he found his gaze lingering on her more than before. He had spent years ignoring her existence, but now, for reasons he couldn't explain, he started to notice things. The way she always seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. The way she sometimes looked at him, not like a servant looking at her employer, but like someone looking at something lost. The way she never asked for anything, never left, never seemed to have a life outside these walls. Why? Late one evening, Ethan stood by the grand window of his office, a drink in hand, staring out into the city skyline. The question gnawed at him. He prided himself on knowing everything that happened in his world, on being in control. And yet, here was Margaret, a woman who had been in his home for decades, and he knew nothing about her. For the first time, that bothered him. Because if there was one thing Ethan Whitmore hated, it was loose ends. Ethan had never been a man to dwell on the insignificant, but Margaret was no longer insignificant. The thought unsettled him. She had been in his house his entire life, yet he knew nothing about her. And now, for reasons he couldn't explain, he needed to know. One evening, as he entered his study, he found Margaret finishing her usual cleaning routine. She moved with quiet precision, her hands steady, her face unreadable. But Ethan wasn't interested in her routine. He was interested in her. "How long have you worked here?" His voice was casual, but there was an edge to it. A test. Margaret barely hesitated. 30 years, sir." Her response was smooth, as if she had expected the question. 30 years. Longer than he had been alive. Ethan studied her, his mind working quickly. That meant she had been here before he was even adopted. Before his name was Whitmore. Before everything. Why? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Why had she stayed? Why had she never left? There was no logic in it. Servants came and went, but Margaret had remained. For the first time, she looked at him directly. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "This is my home," she said simply. But something about her voice struck him. It wasn't just loyalty. It wasn't duty. It was something else. Something heavier. Something dangerous. Ethan nodded slowly, but inside, his instincts flared. Something was wrong, and he intended to find out what. Ethan Whitmore was not a man who let things go unanswered. If there was one thing he despised, it was uncertainty. And now, Margaret had become a question he couldn't ignore. After their brief conversation, her words lingered in his mind. "This is my home." There had been a weight behind them. Something unspoken. Something she hadn't meant for him to hear. What was she hiding? That night, Ethan sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. 30 years. She had been in his home for 30 years. Longer than his own memory stretched back. He pulled up the household records, expecting to find something insignificant. Just another name on a payroll, another disposable employee. But what he found wasn't insignificant at all. Margaret's file was practically empty. No history before the Whitmores. No listed family. No emergency contacts. No background before the day she was hired. That didn't make sense. Everyone had a past. Everyone came from somewhere. But according to these records, Margaret had materialized out of thin air. Ethan's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Something was missing. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that missing pieces always led to secrets. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't over. He wasn't just going to let it go. If Margaret had something to hide, he would find it. Ethan had spent his life uncovering weaknesses, exploiting gaps in information, and controlling every detail of his world. Secrets had no place in his empire. And yet, a woman who had lived under his roof for decades had somehow slipped through the cracks. That was unacceptable. The next morning, he made a call. If the records wouldn't tell him who Margaret was, someone else would. Within hours, he had a private investigator on the case. Every person had a past, a beginning. Margaret was no exception. Days passed, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why had she stayed so long? Why had she never left? Why was she always watching? He had dismissed her presence for years, but now it was all he could think about. One evening, as he walked through the hallways of the mansion, he paused near the servants' quarters. Margaret's room. He had never been inside, never needed to, but tonight, the door was slightly ajar. Curiosity gnawed at him. He stepped inside. The room was small, neat, too neat. No personal belongings, no decorations, no signs of a life outside her work. It was as if she had erased herself. But then, on the bedside table, he saw it, a small, worn-out box. The only thing in the room that didn't belong to the house. Ethan hesitated. Something about it felt private. But his instincts told him that whatever was inside mattered. And Ethan Whitmore didn't ignore his instincts. With steady hands, he lifted the lid. And what he found inside changed everything. Ethan's breath hitched as he stared into the box. Inside, carefully preserved, were fragments of a past he didn't recognize. Photographs, letters, and something that sent a chill down his spine. A tiny hospital bracelet yellowed with age, bearing a name that wasn't his. A name he had never seen before. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the faded photographs. One showed a woman holding a newborn, her face filled with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite place. Joy, fear, sorrow, maybe all three. The child in her arms was small, fragile, unaware of the fate that awaited him. Another photo made his stomach turn. A hospital building, a date written in the corner, the year of his birth. His mind raced. Why would Margaret have these? Why would she keep them hidden all these years? At the bottom of the box, there was a single letter. His fingers felt heavy as he unfolded it. The handwriting was delicate, each word carefully written, as if the writer had put their entire soul into every letter. My son, I never stopped looking for you. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. His vision blurred as 1,000 possibilities crashed down on him at once. He gripped the letter tighter, trying to make sense of the impossible. Margaret had a son, she had lost him, and somehow all of this was connected to him. Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned sharply, and there she was. Margaret stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes held decades of pain. Ethan felt the floor beneath him shift, because suddenly he wasn't sure who he really was anymore. Ethan's grip on the letter tightened as he met Margaret's gaze. The weight of unspoken words filled the space between them, thick and suffocating. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his mind racing to piece together a truth too devastating to comprehend. Margaret didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes filled with something Ethan had never seen before. Not fear, not submission, but something deeper, a desperate, aching sorrow. You knew? Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The accusation lingered in the air, sharp as a blade. You knew all this time. Margaret swallowed hard, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. How could she explain what had been stolen from both of them? How could she tell him that the life he had lived was built on a lie? Ethan felt something inside him crack. He had spent his entire life in control, commanding respect, bending the world to his will. But now, for the first time, he felt powerless. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, was unraveling in his hands. He took a step forward, holding up the letter. Tell me the truth. His voice was low, demanding. Who am I? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Because this wasn't about her pain anymore. This was about Ethan, her son. She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You were stolen from me. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. And in that moment, Ethan Whitmore's world shattered. Ethan felt as if the walls of the mansion were closing in on him. The weight of Margaret's words crashed over him like a tidal wave, pulling him under. Stolen. He had been stolen. The life he had built, the identity he had worn like armor, all of it was a lie. His hands clenched into fists as he turned away, pacing the room. His thoughts swirled in chaotic fragments. His childhood, his parents, the name Whitmore that he had carried with pride. It wasn't his. None of it was his. Margaret stood motionless, watching him. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that none of this changed what he had become. But how could she? How could she tell him that the people he had trusted had been the ones who had betrayed him the most? I don't believe you. Ethan's voice was tight, forced. This is some mistake. But even as he said it, his hands shook. His mind fought against the undeniable truth. The letters, the documents, the memories buried in Margaret's sorrowful eyes. It was all real. They told me you had died. Margaret's voice cracked, raw with years of grief. I held you in my arms, and then they took you from me. They never let me see you again. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, unshakable. But this was breaking him. His breath came shallow as he turned back to Margaret. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words were sharp, accusing. "Why did you stay in this house, watching me, knowing the truth?" Margaret's lips trembled. "Because I was afraid. Because I didn't know if you would accept me. Because I didn't want to lose you again." But she didn't say any of it. Instead, she whispered the only truth that mattered. "Because I love you." Ethan's heart pounded, his body tense. He had spent his life running from emotions, locking them away like a man shielding himself from weakness. But in this moment, as he looked at the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, he didn't know what to do. He had spent years defining himself by power, by control. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of years lost. Margaret had waited for this moment her entire life, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she had won or lost. Ethan stood before her, torn between the man he had been and the truth that threatened to destroy him. And in his eyes, she saw the war raging inside him. Ethan took a shaky breath, his jaw clenched. The anger, the betrayal, the grief, he had no idea where to put it. He wanted to lash out, to blame her, to undo everything he had just learned. But no matter how much he fought it, the truth was there, undeniable. He looked around the mansion, at the empire he had built, at the legacy he had spent his life protecting. None of it belonged to him. The Whitmores had stolen him, raised him as their own, molded him into something he was never meant to be. And Margaret had been there all along, waiting for him to see her. His chest tightened. How many times had she looked at him with quiet sadness? How many moments had he ignored, thinking she was just another servant? The realization made his stomach turn. She had been his mother all along, and he had treated her like she was nothing. Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. "I just needed you to know the truth." Ethan's throat tightened. For the first time in his life, words failed him. He had spent years believing that emotions were weaknesses, but now they were all he had left, and they threatened to consume him. He could walk away, pretend this never happened, keep living the life he had always known, burying the truth beneath the power and wealth that had once defined him. Or he could choose something else, something unknown, something terrifying, something real. His gaze met Margaret's, and for the first time he truly saw her. Not as a housekeeper, not as a stranger, but as a mother. His mother. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." Margaret's lips trembled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We don't have to fix it all at once." A shaky breath escaped him. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had been stolen from them. The years lost, the love denied, the connection they had never been given a chance to have. He didn't know where to begin, but maybe, just maybe, beginning was enough. Ethan took a step closer, and for the first time in his life, he embraced the woman who had never stopped waiting for him. And in that moment, the past no longer defined them. They had a future to rebuild. Together, life has a cruel way of stealing what matters most. Years were taken from Margaret and Ethan, years that no apology, no revelation, no act of redemption could ever bring back. But in the end, the past did not define them. It was the choices they made in the present that truly mattered. Ethan had spent his life believing in power, in control, in the idea that love was nothing more than a distraction. But when faced with the truth, he realized that all the wealth in the world meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. He had been given a second chance, not at reclaiming the past, but at building a future. And for the first time, he wasn't going to run from it. Margaret had waited decades for this moment, for the day her son would finally see her. She had endured pain that no mother should ever have to bear, living in silence while watching the child she lost become a man who never knew she existed. But she never stopped loving him. And that love, no matter how much time had passed, was the one thing that had never been stolen. This story is a reminder of how fragile time is, how easily the truth can be buried, how quickly life can slip through our fingers. But it is also a testament to something far greater: the power of forgiveness, the resilience of love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. So, now I ask you, what would you do if everything you believed about your life turned out to be a lie? Would you have the strength to face the truth, to forgive, to start over? Because in the end, it's not about the years lost. It's about the love that survives despite it all.